Chapter 1, entitled, I Know a Higher Chivalry. "Oh, what a dolt I am," growled young Robert to himself. "I'm forever blurting out my inmost thoughts. I do it at school, at play, and now I've done it before my father. When will I learn to keep my mouth shut?" He groaned as he laid his head against the window and gazed into a November sky. High above him, the evening star began to sparkle. In the deeper west, night stood like a black-cowled monk waiting the compline bell of what had been a beautiful day. But Robert saw no star, no cowled night, nor dying day. He saw nothing but the amazed look his father had flashed at him when he had overheard him say to his cousin, "I will never be knighted. I know a higher chivalry." Behind him, an aged serf was quietly removing the last traces of the banquet that had been spread for the newly knighted Jacques, Robert's cousin from across the Seine. The old man now lit a torch, placed it above the table, and left the hall. As he opened the heavy oaken door, a booming voice and laugh of Theodoric, lord of the castle, carried into the quiet of the room. Robert stirred uneasily. He stood in awe of this giant father of his. He knew that his remark at table had been displeasing, and that he would be called to answer for it before the night was out. For a moment longer he pressed his forehead moodily against the window pane. Suddenly he straightened. "All right," he said. "I will answer for it. The truth must come out sometime. Tonight is as good a time as any." And his hands tightened into fists above his leather belt. It was thus his mother found him when she returned to the hall after bidding her guests adieu. For a moment she stood watching him. His head was lifted to the skies. The firm, straight lines of his jaw and chin were bas-relieved against the blue-black of the twilight. Ermengarde thrilled at the sight. Her boy was fast becoming a man, she thought. Then, as a half-sigh escaped, she softly chided herself. Ermengarde, babies become boys, and boys fast become young men. Then she proudly murmured, "He's becoming quite like his father. He will be a big man." As Robert had not stirred, she quietly came up behind him, laid her hands on his shoulders, and asked, "Is my boy becoming a stargazer?" The lad started at her touch, but at the sound of her voice, his hands shot up and drew her arms around his shoulders. "Look," he said, and pointed to the white radiance of the solitary star that shone in the broad blue bosom of the twilight. "It's beautiful, but so awfully, awfully alone. It looks lost, doesn't it?" Ermengarde laid her cheek on his shoulder. "Stargazer, dreamer, poet, just what is to become of you, my boy?" Robert's arm stole around his mother's waist. A mischievous twinkle came into his eyes as he said, "Your words are right, mother, but their order is wrong. You should have asked what father will ask the moment he returns. You should have said, 'Just what are you going to become, my boy?' And wait until you hear the way he says it." The last word had hardly been spoken when Theodoric burst into the hall. "Ermengarde," he cried in his heavy, booming voice, "my brother Léon tells me his harvest was just like ours, 3 times normal size. Indeed, we will make up for the past 3 years of—" But then his gaze fell upon Robert. The lights in his large black eyes changed. A frown clouded his forehead, and his chin drew in towards his chest. This was what Ermengarde always called swallowing himself in his bushy black beard. She smiled to herself as her husband noisily cleared his throat, strode to the fireplace, and threw on a heavy log. She recognized these as his usual prelude to broaching an important subject. What a transparent person was this giant knight. Sure enough, as he stood dusting his hands, Theodoric said, "Son, you made a remark to your cousin tonight that I did not understand." Ermengarde felt Robert grow tense. "I want to understand it, son, fully. Just what did you mean by saying that you will never be knighted?" Robert's hands gripped the table. His father was a giant of a man in any setting, but outlined as he was now by the leaping blaze in the fireplace, he loomed larger than ever. The room grew very still. Robert's throat felt terribly dry. He knew that his father had his heart set on the day when he would be dubbed Knight of Champagne, that he had dreamed fondly of the time he would ride with him to tournament or to battle, armed as he was armed, strong as he was strong, and brave as his own undaunted bravery. Robert did not question his father's love, nor did he fear his flashes of anger, but he did dread the hurt he would give this huge, kindly man when he told him the truth. As his father broke in on his thoughts with an impatient, "Well?" the latest log on the fire snapped and cracked fiercely, sending fountains of sparks leaping up the chimney and arching down the stony apron of the floor. The two sharp reports in the otherwise still room made young Robert start visibly, but paradoxically, this uncontrolled action gave him the control he had longed for. His arms relaxed, although his nails were still digging into the palms of his hands. His voice and gaze were steady as he answered, "I meant what I said, sire. I will never be knighted, for I know a higher chivalry." "And what is that?" asked Theodoric, as his black eyes bored into the brown ones before him. "The highest chivalry this side of heaven, sire, the chivalry of being gallant to God." Robert's head lifted with the last word, and his shoulders squared. He was staring at his father with a look that was almost defiant. Ermengarde caught her breath as she gazed from the challenging tilt of her son's young head to the sunken chin of her lord. Theodoric heard her and deliberately turned his back on the boy. He carefully brushed a few of the cinders back into the base of the fire with his boot. Then, with a forced calmness, he strolled to the back of his wife's chair. "Won't you sit down, son?" he asked, as he gestured toward a chair, "and explain yourself more fully. I know of only one chivalry for the Knights of Champagne. What is this higher chivalry of yours?" His tone was deeper and his voice softer, but Robert, looking into those boring black eyes, found their light unchanged. "I'll stand, sire, if I may," answered the lad as he stepped away from the table and moved toward the fireplace. He turned and faced his parents. The dancing flames sent strange shadows flickering across his set features. Theodoric, studying those features, suddenly realized he was talking to a man, not to a boy. His son seemed to have aged before his eyes. He looked down at Ermengarde and found her with her hands folded in her lap. Calmness marked her whole posture. He was glad he had shifted his glance, for her composure steadied him. Looking up a moment later, he was not surprised to see the shadow of a smile flit across his son's face. "Well," said Theodoric, as Robert stood there seemingly waiting for an invitation. "Sire, I'm as stout and as strong as Cousin Jacques, am I not?" His father nodded. "I can ride as well as Cousin Jacques, can I not?" Again his father nodded. There was vibrancy in the lad's tone. "I can tilt as well as Cousin Jacques, can I not? I have unhorsed him twice while jousting in our own yard." Theodoric wondered where his son's questions were leading. He simply nodded a third time. "Cousin Jacques was knighted in Troyes last week. We banqueted him this afternoon to do him honor and to show our joy, sire. I am not jealous of my cousin. I am not afraid of knighthood and all that it entails. But there were 2 reasons I was not dubbed last week. Age was one, and the other lies here." One hand clenched over his heart. Then his whole countenance became alive with light as he blurted out, "Sire, I want to be gallant to God. I want to become a monk." "A what?" barked Theodoric, and the thunder of his tone filled the hall. Robert's color mounted, but his eyes held their unwavering gaze. He had expected this. Only last week he had begged his mother not to say anything to his father before the end of the year. Well, now he knew in early November. The boy felt relieved in spite of his anxiety. Before his father had fully recovered, he pushed on. "Sire, I have been schooled by the monks, but from them I learned more than my trivium. From them I learned the higher chivalry. You gave much to the poor and the starving during the past 3 years of famine, sire. Uncle Léon across the Seine gave much also. I am justly proud of the blood from which I am sprung." Again that vehemence came into his voice as he cried, "But sire, the monks gave more." Theodoric waited. Never before had he heard his son speak thus. The boy was aflame. "For the past 3 years, the gate of St. Pierre de la Selle has been thronged with the starving," said Robert. "No single serf ever left that gate empty-handed. To do that, the monks starved themselves. Do you hear, sire? They starved themselves." After a pause, Robert added, "It was then that I began to see that one did not have to wear mail or wield a battle axe in order to be brave. It was then I saw that there was a higher chivalry than chivalry itself." Robert's tone deepened. "Since then I have prayed and consulted. The priest will receive me. Mother is willing that I go. I confess my cowardice in not telling you sooner, sire, but now I beg your pardon, your blessing, and your permission." The last words had tumbled out. It was the longest speech Robert had ever made to his father. He knew that he had been headlong in his confession. He now felt self-conscious and somewhat abashed. There was a strong temptation to enlist the aid of his mother, but he resolved to hold his ground and stand on his own feet. His father's boring black eyes never wavered. The boy thought he saw the lips draw in beneath the bushy beard, but he was not sure. His own fists tightened, and he waited. "Who put this idea into your head?" asked Theodoric coldly. "Your mother or the monks?" "Neither," said Robert as he felt his anger surge. "Then who?" questioned Theodoric, and there was a noticeable edge to his tone. "God," answered his son, and the word rang through the room with all the sharpness of a sword dashing on shield. More. It had the effect of a thunderbolt bursting. There was no rumble or reverberation after that word, but the silence that held the hall seemed to shake it. Theodoric shifted his position to the side of his wife's chair. He had been startled by the answer his son had given, but more so by the fires he found in the depths of those 2 brown eyes that gazed at him so steadily. Silence still held the hall. The only sound heard was the gentle murmur of the fire and the soft fall of the ashes as the log crumpled within the flames. Theodoric was stunned by this announcement. Robert had been the son of his life. He doted on him. To other nobles he had often boasted what a knight this boy would be. The ceremonies of last week and the banquet of this afternoon had filled him with one vision, that of his son at the feet of the Count of Champagne, surrounded by the knights of the realm, with the flat of the Count's sword on his back. The picture called up by the knight's announcement, that of his boy with shaven head and flowing cowl, did not strike his fancy at all. He grew angry. But two things held that anger in check: the presence of his gentle wife and the ring of the last word his son had spoken. Walking away from Ermengarde's chair, Theodoric motioned his son to the cushion at his wife's feet. He himself took his stand before the fireplace. "Sit down by your mother, Robert," he commanded. "This calls for more explanation than you have given." The boy marveled at the quietness of his father's voice and manner. "You say God put this idea into your head. May I ask when?" "That would be very difficult to say, sire. I really think the tendency has always been there." "Oh," said Theodoric. "So it is no more than a tendency. God made no direct personal manifestation of any sort, eh?" "Well, that of course changes matters." Robert started to his feet, but his mother's hand, falling on his shoulder, restrained him. "Be calm, son," she cautioned. "Your father is right. He should inquire." "Don't you know, my boy," began Theodoric, "that practically everyone is struck by such a fancy sometime or other in his youth?" The Lord lifted himself several times on his toes before adding, "Why, even I was struck by it." And Theodoric gave vent to a deep, throaty chuckle. "I don't think your mother will deny that that was pure fancy. Can you imagine me as a monk?" Again Theodoric's laugh filled the room. Ermengarde smiled, but Robert only shifted uneasily on his cushion. Theodoric eyed him carefully. He had hoped to see a smile light the face of his son. He grew restless. Theodoric had no patience with opposition, for he had experienced very little. His serfs were always subservient, and his fellow lords respectful. The present attitude of his boy made his blood boil. Since there had been no special manifestation from God, he felt sure that his son's attraction to the cloister was but a passing phase of youth. He would end this interview before it became painful. Robert would outgrow this fancy, and one day, as a staunch knight of Champagne, would make him proud. Maintaining his former light tone, he said, "Your shoulders are too broad and your thighs too thick to be hidden by a cowl, my boy. God blessed you with the body of a warrior. You belong astride a swift horse with a mace or a battle axe in your hand." "Is the cloister only for weaklings?" challenged Robert. No, no, answered Theodoric quickly, "but real warriors are for the world." He tried to stir the boy's pride in arms. "And you are going to be a real warrior, my boy. Your eyes have told me so. You have more than a magnificent physique, son. You have fire." The remoteness of Robert's expression disappointed Theodoric, but it showed him that nothing was to be gained by further argument. So with an air of confident command, he said, "But come, it's growing late. It's time for young men to be in bed. This fancy will pass." "Sire," blurted Robert, jumping to his feet, despite his mother's restraining hand, "it is not fancy. It will not pass. I am no longer a baby." The boy was trembling. His face was more flushed than ever. He stood before his father with brown eyes ablaze and fists clenched at his sides. Theodoric had never before seen his son so aroused. The sight startled him. He noted the quivering lips and the tremor in the arms and hands. He saw that he had stung the boy to near fury. At the moment, he knew not what to say or do. A wrong word would unleash the pent-up anger. A false gesture wound the strong young heart. He simply met the burning gaze of his boy with a steady, level glance. Ermengarde, who had risen from her chair as Robert had sprung from his cushion, now stepped to the boy's side, circled his shoulders with her arm, smiled slowly, and said, "Father may forget that time flies, son, but if you keep springing up like that, he'll never forget you're no longer a baby." But not even Ermengarde could bridge the gap between them. "Father," said Robert in a fiercely earnest tone, "I'm sorry if I have shown anything bordering on disrespect, but sire," and the old ring of deadly determination came back into the boy's voice, "I wish you would remember that I am 3 years older than Theophylactus, who Uncle Leon said is going to be elected pope." Robert could have said nothing worse. Had he drawn sword and openly attacked his father, he would not have wounded him so deeply as by this reference to the papacy. Theodoric was a vibrantly Catholic soul. Nothing caused him so much concern as did the condition of the church. When he had seen the house of Tusculum dominating the papal throne, he had grown uneasy. When Benedict VIII had died in 1024 and his brother Romanus, though still a layman, had been elected to succeed him, Theodoric had become angry. But Romanus, as John the 19th, while not a saintly pontiff, had been morally clean. He had died only last week. Then the report had come that Romanus was to be succeeded by Theophylactus, his 12-year-old nephew. Theodoric was near to rage. To have his own son point to this immoral boy as argument made the blood of the Lord's veins run deadly cold. His black eyes became 2 tiny pinpoints of fire. He pointed to the door. One word only would he allow himself. He said, "Go!" Robert had watched the transformation with wonder. He was keen enough to realize that this cold sternness was more dangerous than any noisy anger. The boy found his way to his room in a stupor. He did not know what had struck his father, but he never wanted to look again in those 2 black pinpoints of fire that were his eyes. When Robert had gone, Ermengarde crossed the room quickly, took her husband's arm, and said, "Sit down, my lord, we have much to talk about." He was still in the grip of the cold fury that had seized him at the mention of Theophylactus. "Theodoric," she said softly, "that was a most unfortunate reference. Robert loves you, my lord. He all but adores you. He wouldn't hurt you for the world. That is why he has kept me from mentioning this matter to you before. He knows your hopes for him. He feared to disappoint you." Theodoric sat with forearms on his knees, and unseeing gaze bent on the gold-blue flames that leapt in the fireplace. He looked as if he had not heard his wife. Ermengarde waited for a reaction. When she got none, she decided to use an old stratagem. She would trick him into argument. "But," she resumed, "if you ask me, I would say that the boy had much the better of the debate tonight." Theodoric sat back. "Yes," went on Ermengarde, "much the better. He had sound arguments. You made mere statements." "What do you mean?" snapped her husband. "Do you mean to tell me that I was wrong when I said he's only a boy?" "He didn't look much like a boy to me as he stood glaring at you a little while ago." Ermengarde smiled at the memory of that picture. "He looked more like a warrior, and he sounded like a conqueror." "Oh, physically, he's big for his age," granted Theodoric grumblingly. "But let us not forget his age. He is 15 years old, and that's all." "That's only one of your mistakes, my noble lord. 15 is not all that Robert is. This is the year 1033, said Theodoric, who was now equal to attempting irony. He was born in 1018. According to my poor scholarship, that makes him just 15, and that's all. Ermengarde drew her chair nearer. Mathematically, you are correct, my dear, but there are other ways of reckoning the years. What is the age of Robert's soul? The same as his body, 15, that's all. Still making mistakes, Theodoric. With sudden change of tone and countenance, she went on. You're forgetting the rain, my lord. Sun matures fruit. Rain matures men. 3 sunless years of almost uninterrupted rain brought famine. Famine brought death. Death opened the eyes of men to life. Men matured faster in the last 3 years, Theodoric, than they normally do in 30. They have learned what life is for. They have become God-oriented. The restless flames in the fireplace threw shadows that leapt and fell with strange, weird life on the blackened rafters of the ceiling. Theodoric lifted his head, stared at them a moment, then murmured, God-oriented. What a word! Yet how perfectly expressive. Rain did turn men to God, but, he added slowly, Robert is not a man. He is too young to have been deeply affected by the awful scourge God just lifted from our backs. Youth takes tragedy the way it takes pleasure, merely as a passing phase. You don't know your son, Theodoric, said Ermengarde earnestly. Robert has nothing shallow about him. His soul is deep, his mind mature. After that debate tonight, you shouldn't doubt it. At least twice he had you speechless. Theodoric nodded assent. Yes, he said slowly. He did have me speechless at least twice. He had me frightened. When he told me that God put the idea in his head, I grew most uneasy. I thought he was talking about some sort of private revelation. Oh, tush, broke in Ermengarde impatiently. What did you expect? Did you think he had been knocked from his horse like St. Paul? Now look here, Theodoric. The boy is a physical giant, isn't he? Yes, he is big for his age. He promises to grow into a stalwart man. All right. Then he has the physical qualifications demanded by the cloister. He is healthy. As for his moral qualifications, there is no question. The boy is as good as gold. Have you seen a vicious trait in him? He's stubborn and he grows vehement. Why, the way he blurted out some of his statements tonight took my breath away. But it is the stubbornness that is serious. Stubborn, said Ermengarde. Would he be his father's son if he weren't stubborn? But that's a blessing, my lord. No man ever amounted to anything unless he had a stubborn streak in him. But you give it the wrong name. It's not a vice, it's a virtue. Its proper name is willpower, persistency. And let me tell you, Robert has that. Come now, admit that the lad has the moral qualifications. Theodoric's teeth gleamed between parted lips. For the sake of argument, he smiled, I'll admit it. Ermengarde was glad to see that smile. She pushed on. As for his mental ability, you've seen a specimen of it tonight. His record at school is high. He is not a genius, but he is a bit above ordinary. So, my lord, God, by giving him the necessary mental, moral, and physical qualifications, plus the burning desire to dedicate himself to life in the cloister, has really manifested divine plans as definitely, if not expressly, as if he had thrown him from his horse and spoken to him from heaven. Any priest will tell you that those are the signs of a genuine vocation. But he's too young, snapped Theodoric testily. What does he know about life, about the cloister, About himself. 15 is no age at which to fling away life. Why, he hasn't even tasted it. Shame, cried Ermengarde. Shame on Theodoric. Shame on the giant noble of Champagne. First, Robert is more than 15 mentally. Secondly, one who goes to the cloister does not fling away life. Finally, what most of you men mean by tasting life is drinking it to its dregs. Oh, you make me tired. A boy is never too young to learn the ways of a warrior. No lad is ever too young to be taught how to ride, to tilt, to kill. No. But there is one profession for which he may be too young. Yes, just one. Never too young to enter the service of his temporal sovereign, but to enter the service of his eternal king. To enter the service of his eternal king, he must be a man, broke in Theodoric. Saint Benedict took babies, countered his wife. Oh, Saint Benedict has been dead a long, long time, growled the lord of the land, who was now thoroughly aroused. And the world has changed much since he died. Why, when Benedict was a boy, the world was in barbarism. The Roman Empire had collapsed, honeycombed by rottenness within, overrun by savage tribes from without. Ruin was inevitable, and the church was in as good a condition as the empire, rent by schism, beset by heresy. She too seemed on the brink of ruin. No wonder Benedict fled to Subiaco. No wonder he allowed nobles to offer their newborn babies to the Lord. Why, the cloister seemed the only place a man could save his soul. But that was 5 long centuries ago. Theodoric shifted in his chair before adding, Today is different. Look at our truce of God. Look at our chivalry. Look at what you call yourself our God-orientedness. Ermengarde sat back, put her head a little on one side, and with the tiniest trace of a frown on her forehead, said, You puzzle me, Theodoric. I don't believe there is another noble in the realm so devoted to the church as you, and yet you object to your son becoming a churchman? Theodoric went to the fire and placed another log across the burning embers. He watched the gluttonous tongues of yellow and gold lick at its sides for a moment, then turned full on his wife. Ermengarde, my dear, it is just because I am so devoted to my church and so devoted to my son that I object. I don't want our boy to make a mistake. Humph. If he doesn't make mistakes, he'll never make anything. He's human. It's no crime to make a mistake. Tragedy lies in failing to unmake them. And that's my point precisely, interjected Theodoric sharply. I'm not afraid of Robert's making a mistake. I'm mortally afraid of his being a mistake. You know something of our world, my dear. You know there are those in the ranks of the clergy who should never have seen the inside of a cloister. Now, he went on quickly as his wife started to protest, I know what you're going to say. It is utterly and shamefully true that many have been made bishops and pastors by the will of greedy nobles rather than by the will of God. Lay investiture is a curse. Many, if not most, of the scandals of the church are traceable to the kings, counts, emperors, and dukes who look upon croziers and rings as means to power rather than as emblems of ecclesiastical authority. They don't want pastors of the people in those offices. They want robbers who will fill their greedy purses. I grant all that. In spite of what I said about improvement, the church is not lily white. But the point I make is that there is no more sorry sight in all our land than that of a mistake in clerical garb. But Robert would not, I know Robert would not be such a mistake. But frankly, I do fear his age. I don't want him to go through life with the scar of a tremendous failure on his soul to remind him always of the folly of his youth. He won't fail. What makes you so positive, my dear? Asked Theodoric with a very noticeable touch of incredulity in his tone. Do you realize that what the cloister demands? He paused before saying, It calls for the noblest of men and the noblest in man. It demands great physical endurance and a startling single-mindedness of purpose. Success can be achieved there only by those who have the inflexible vision of invincible faith. One must stare fixedly and uninterruptedly at God, my dear. Yes, uninterruptedly at God. And I'm afraid that most men have only the eyes of the bat for that strong sun. The eyes of the eagle are required for those who would go to this cloister. And do you think our son is blind? Not at all. I question whether his eyes are fully open at 15. That is about the 5th time that you have referred to Robert as 15. For the last time I tell you that he is more than 15. It's not age that you want in the cloister, it's maturity. And Robert is mature. A person is really mature, said Ermengarde, when he realizes that he belongs to God. And that lesson was forcibly taught by Raymond. France has become God-oriented, Theodoric, for the lack of sun opened our eyes to the light of the world. Come, face the facts. With that, Ermengarde rose out of her chair, approached her husband, reached up, and with pleading eyes said, My lord, take my word for it. Our boy was born for the cloister. He will make no mistake. He will be no mistake. God gave him to us. Let us give him back to God. When Theodoric made no reply, she added, Chivalry is growing in the world. Let our boy bring it to the cloister. Let him go and be gallant to God. Theodoric was startled by her earnestness. Slowly he clasped her to his breast. He bent his head to her ear and said, My dear, you have never told me whether there is any truth or not in the tale that has oft been spoken in hushed tones by our serfs. They say that some months before our boy was born, the Blessed Virgin came to you and spoke of espousing the child to your womb. They say that some months before our boy was born, the Blessed Virgin came to you and spoke of espousing the child of your womb. Ermengarde held him closer. The bent wife of Ulrich, the oldest of our vassals, says the Virgin placed a ring on your finger as a sign of the sacred espousal. Is that why you say Robert was born for the cloister? Is it? Or is this pious legend only serf simplicity? The fire had died to glowing coals. No single flame flickered on the hearth. No shadow waved upon the wall. It seemed a long time before Ermengarde answered, When is a dream not a dream, my love? Theodoric drew back to look at her. Tell me, he pleaded. When it's a vision, said Ermengarde. Theodoric's eyes were of a softness that his son had never seen. He could not speak, but kneeling he kissed his wife's hands. Ermengarde bent down to him with a smile. But I haven't really answered your question. Perhaps it was only a dream, but if so, wasn't it a beautiful one? Could you fancy anything more heavenly for an expectant mother? If it was more than a dream, she added, wouldn't one be obliged to keep the secret of the queen? Come, my lord, let us retire. Our boy will go to St. Pierre's. He will be gallant to God. And she led her husband from the room where the red glow soon died, and the November moon threw pale shadows across the floor. As they passed Robert's room, they never guessed that he was still awake and at the window. At first he only wanted to feel the cool night air, but soon the jingle of a bridle and the clop-clop of horses' hooves had him thinking of his cousin Jacques with his knighthood so newly upon him. Then he strained his eyes to the north as if he would see the spires of St. Pierre. Knighthood of a higher kind awaited him there, he thought. He must convince his father that this was the year for him to enter. He must. Gradually, under the spell of the night, calmness came. As his parents passed his door, he was marveling at the multitude of stars that followed in the wake of Vesper's shining. Their footsteps turned him from the splendor of the skies. He pulled his robe over his head and wondered what his mother might have told his father. As he threw it across the chair, he muttered determinedly, "Well, I won't be knighted, and whether he admits it or not, there is a higher chivalry." Then, kicking off his boots, he turned his back to the stars and knelt by the side of his bed.